Hi, I'm Skip Richter with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I'm horticulturist in Brazos County, and today we're going to be talking about protecting plants against frosts and freezes. When the first frost or freeze of the season arrives, these warm season annuals as well as warm season vegetables, including some of those tender tropicals we like to keep around the landscape, are going to be in trouble if we don't provide them a little bit of protection. Frosts and freezes can occur in different ways. We can have a very still night where the heat radiates off the plants and off the soil and things cool down. That's typically the kind of conditions we'd see in a frost as well as in a freeze. Or we have what we call an advective freeze, where a blue norther comes through and it's just the temperature drops and the wind blows and there's not really a frost, but there's a very hard freeze. The first type of freeze, the radiative type of freeze, it's pretty easy to protect plants in those. The advective freezes are a little bit more challenging, but we're going to talk about both ways and some techniques that you can do that. First, I want to talk a little bit about how frosts and freezes occur. Now, it may seem kind of obvious that when the temperature drops below 32, that's freezing. But you can actually have a frost when the temperature has not dropped below 32 in the air around you. And the way that happens is, on a cold night, the leaf surfaces or the fruit or the flower surfaces of the plant, they radiate out heat, and they can lose heat faster than the air temperature itself drops. So the surface of the leaf can actually get colder than the air temperature around it, and in that case the surface of the leaf is cold enough to where water from the air condenses on the plant and freezes in the form of a frost. So the temperature may be 32 or 34 in the air, but you've got frost on your plants, and that's how that happens. Now, anything that helps slow that loss of heat will help prevent frost from forming on the plant. You may have noticed on a frosty night, if you have a live oak tree or some other tree that has leaves in the winter, underneath the tree there's no frost on the grass. But out where the lawn is exposed to the sunlight, there's a lot of frost forming because of that radiating loss of the heat on those plants, or whether it's grass or vegetables or flowers. So anything that covers the plant can help slow that radiative loss of heat. That's one of our strategies of protecting plants against frosts and freezes. On plants like these marigolds are beautiful in the fall. That's really I think their best season. They just glow with color in the reds and yellows, or the oranges and the yellows that they have. But when the first frost comes, it turns them all to toast. So if we can extend that a little further, it's almost like having little mums in the landscape that'll extend that season out a little further for you. So let's talk about some ways that we protect plants. But before we get into protection, I want to talk a little bit about the plants themselves and what we can do culturally to help them to not be so susceptible to a frost or freeze. Some plants, such as citrus, can be really cold tender. In fact, we grow them in the southern part of Texas for that reason. But on things like these satsumas, you can take them farther and farther north to a certain point by giving them a little cold protection. But another thing that's important on these kinds of plants is that you want the plant to be as strong and as hardy as it can be before the freeze occurs. Now, sometimes we can't control that. For example, when it's been 80 degrees all week and then all of a sudden the temperature drops down in the upper 20s, to exaggerate a little bit, only a little bit in Texas, that plant's not ready and it's going to suffer cold damage. If, on the other hand, the temperature slowly moved down and it became more acclimated to the cold, then when you do get a little bit of a freeze, it's more likely to be able to withstand it. And that's not just citrus. That would be other plants that kind of play out at some point going north through Texas, like Duranta, for example, is that way. The Esperanza or yellow bells is another one that, if you go from San Antonio up to Dallas, somewhere in there, those plants are going to be too far north and get cold damage. So making sure they have a chance to slow down. We don't want to fertilize and push them with a lot of fertilizer and water late in the summer, early fall season to create a lot of succulent new growth. because that kind of growth is just not going to be able to withstand a freeze as well as other parts of the plant would. Another thing that we want to be aware of is that at the end of the day, the southwest sky is where the sun is. And so that sun is shining into the trunk of the tree. And a plant, and this would be not just for something like citrus, but other young trees with real thin bark as well, it warms that trunk up. This can happen to peach trees, what I'm about to describe. And that bark becomes more active, and then that night the temperature drops well below freezing, and you get freeze damage on the southwest side of the trunk, whereas the rest of the tree doesn't suffer freeze damage because it's in a hardier, more ready for the cold weather state. So that would be a case where either painting the trunk white with a latex paint or providing some kind of a shade or protection from that southwest sun might be helpful. So not fertilizing and watering a lot as we go into the fall season on these semi-tender plants. Making, if the weather cooperates and gives us a little bit slower cooling off period before the hard freeze hits, they're more likely to be able to withstand that kind of cold temperature. So now let's talk about some things that we can do to protect plants against frosts and freezes. The simplest way to protect plants is with a cover. Now you've probably used sheets and blankets to throw them over a flower bed or some vegetable plants to protect them on a cold night, and that works really well. There are also other materials that we can use. One of my favorite is the heavier weight row cover fabrics, like this one right here. These come in several different weights. Some are super lightweight and you can literally see through them, and those are good for protecting young seedlings coming up from pests that might want to chew on them. They don't provide a lot of cold protection. The heavier weights, and I say heavier, it actually is about 1.5 ounces per square yard, so that's really light. That's why they call them floating row covers, because with plants they can literally just be set on top of the plants, and as the plant grows it just lifts the row cover up. They won't crush them. What we often do though with the covers is we'll put a hoop over the row in order to hold the cover up so that we can put some source of heat underneath here, or if we have young seedlings on a cold rainy night, it'll just wash this cover down into the soil and the seedlings, and that is a problem in and of itself. So the hoops aren't necessary for the row cover, but they do help hold it up off of the plants. You can use PVC to make these kinds of hoops. What I like to do is use a section of rebar pipe, and you can see here that I've hammered in just about a 1 foot long section of rebar that's small enough to fit inside this 1/2 inch PVC. And then you just slide the pipe on one side and then slide the pipe down over the rebar on the other side, and it makes a very sturdy hoop. You don't need a central pole, but although you can put one down the row for support if you want. And by putting this over the pepper plants, in this case, and securing it, I have clamps right here just because it's a windy day, but what you want to do is allow about a foot of this fabric on each side, and then use bricks or boards, or I'll just take a shovel and scoop some soil over the edge, because you want to seal it down, hold it down, because on a windy night it'll just blow off, and then all your hopes are disappointed by that night's freeze. So that's one good way to protect plants against frosts and freezes when it doesn't get too cold. Another option is to use plastic. I like to use clear plastic. You want something that's about 4 mil to 6 mil thick. That's a pretty sturdy plastic. And when plastic touches the plant on a freezing night, you'll get a little bit of freeze burn on those leaves. So having the hoops can help keep it off of the leaves. But actually, to be honest, on a frosty night, if you're trying to save the plant, burn on a few outer leaves is a very small price to pay to be able to save the plant. The thing I like about plastic is that it creates dead air space inside this tunnel. And again, you cover it over, you cover the edges with soil because you want to seal that air in, and then at the end you close it down and cover it with soil as well. So now you have a dead airspace tunnel to hold that air, and the soil inside is going to radiate heat all night, and that's going to provide a significant difference. I have planted tomatoes really early, I mean a month and a half too early in the season, And by using a cover of plastic and adding one more tip, and that's a jug of milk, a jug of water in a milk jug right beside each tomato plant, I've gotten them through just fine and gotten a really early head start for, you got to have the bragging rights of the earliest tomato in the neighborhood, right? With that milk jug of water, the water itself loses heat slower than the air. So as the air temperature is dropping inside the tunnel, that water is giving off heat. Maybe the water is 50 degrees or 40 degrees, but it's still warm compared to the air around it, and it prevents the tissues of that tomato. It's giving off heat and protects them. Now, it's not going to take it down to 0 degrees, but I'm just giving you some tips of ways that you can extend your cold protection further and further. The next thing that I want to mention about the plastic is, while you want to seal it off on a cold night, the next day you want to open the ends of the tunnel to allow that hot air to escape. Have you ever been out in your car when the sun has been shining through the windshield? It doesn't have to be a summer day. I mean, it can be 50 degrees outside and it's 90-something degrees inside the car with the sun shining through the windshield. You don't want it to get too hot in the tunnel. So we open it during the day. The sun heats the soil. You come home from work at the end of the day, close that tunnel down, seal it up, and you've got a nice warm area with that warm soil that'll take you through a pretty cold night. Now let's talk about protecting citrus and a few other tips on protecting plants. Okay, now we're going to take it up a level on cold protection. We're back with our citrus again, and I've kind of got a little miniature example of an idea, and that is to use the long PVC hoops over the entire tree. You can purchase gray PVC in 20-foot lengths, and those make a pretty good hoop over most of your smaller citrus trees, like a mandarin orange, for example, before it gets too old. Those gray PVC sections, the half-inch sections, have a bell at one end. So one PVC can just slip into the other, and you can even make a longer hoop if you want. Something that'll cover the entire citrus plant like this small one is covered with the PVC. The next step in protection is to provide some kind of heat underneath the cover. And I think the easiest way to do that is by just using a light bulb. If you get about a 100-watt light bulb and put it in a clamp cover like this and put it underneath the plant, the heat from that bulb rising up underneath that plastic cover produces a significant amount of warming on a very, very cold night. Now, if you wanted to go up even warmer, depending on how cold it's getting and how large the area under the cover is, you could use more of a floodlight with a 150-watt bulb, or even go as far as a heat lamp. But you want to be careful about a couple of things. Number one, you wouldn't want something like this shining at the trunk tissues or even leaf tissues, because it gets really hot and it'll burn them. And if you had weeds or grass around your plants, I know you don't allow weeds in your garden, but if you did and there were dry grass, that could also potentially be a fire hazard. So you want to, in the case of nice bare soil like this, I would probably just put the clamp in here, attach it maybe to the side of the cover, and shine it kind of downward where it's not heating up the plant, but it's heating up the soil itself, and then that heat is rising up underneath the cover. The other thing that you want to be careful about is your electrical connections. A lot of times when a cold front blows in, it brings with it some rainy weather. And so if you've got frayed cords or if you have exposed electrical connections, there's a danger there of a short. And if this connection is laying down in dry plant material, there is a danger of a fire. And we have pictures of folks that have done that and set the entire tree on fire, which did keep it from freezing, but didn't end up very well, as you can imagine. So providing some additional warmth under the tree. I mentioned about water before. If you just have a citrus tree or two and you wanted to put 4 or 5 gallon buckets of water underneath it, just know that that's going to provide some measure of warmth. It's going to, that water itself losing the warmth is going to protect the tree. Now, one last thing I want to talk about with cold protection on plants is you probably have seen pictures of orchards, maybe a orange grove in Florida, where they had sprayed water on the plants and there was ice all over the plants, and the idea was to protect them on a freezing night. That can work but often it goes badly, and here's why. When water lands on the tissues of this plant and it freezes, every milliliter of water or cubic centimeter of water gives off 1 calorie of heat. When water changes from a liquid to a solid form, it gives off heat. And so as long as you continue to put liquid water on the plant and it freezes and it freezes and the ice gets bigger and bigger, the inside is not going to drop below freezing as long as there's liquid water forming on the plant. Now that's not when it's going to be 5 degrees outside, but if it's in the let's say the mid-20s or something where it's just too cold for most citrus, it can provide that protection. Where it goes bad is, number one, people don't have the kind of sprinkler equipment that puts out just a little bit of water. They have big sprinklers that create an entire lake by morning around the tree, and that soggy, wet conditions is not good for the plant. The other thing is that load of ice ends up splitting the tree and breaking all the branches. So rather than spraying the tree itself with water, what you should do is spray the water down low. So ice forms down low or on some of the lower branches, and that warmth is still there from the water to rise up if you have a cover. The nice thing about citrus being a evergreen plant is that canopy is, again, help holding the rising heat as it comes up through the plant, unless we have a windy night to push it away. So the idea of using water as a way to protect plants can work, but the ice load and the fact that you've got to continue to run the water even after the temperature goes above freezing, and here's why. Remember how I said when water changes state from liquid to solid, it gives off a tiny bit of heat? Well, if in the morning it rises to 33 degrees and you say, okay, the freeze is over, and you turn off the water, as the water goes from an ice back to liquid, it pulls that degree of heat back as it changes stages one way or the other. So you can have super cooling in the plant because of that evaporation. And one example of that would be if there's a wind blowing and you dip your hand in water and then hold it out in the wind, it feels very cool, right? Well, the reason it feels cool is because water's changing from a liquid to a gas. It's evaporating off of your hand and it's cooling. That's how swamp coolers work, right? So that change of state of water is something we can use for our advantage, but it's also something that can work the other way. So if you did use ice, you would just want to let the water keep running, keep adding new water until it rises, the temperature rises up enough to where you're not into the 40s or something like that, where you're not as concerned about that super cooling. I want to thank you for joining us on Aggie Horticulture Facebook Live today. I also want to thank the horticulture specialists and county horticulturists who've been answering your questions online. If you'd like more free information on protecting plants from frosts and freezes, this publication, Protecting Landscapes and Horticulture Crops from Frosts and Freezes, is available online at agrilifebookstore.org. It's got 9 pages that go into much more depth than I've had time to go into today, and I think you'll find it very helpful. Thanks again.